Hello, everyone. We're back for part 2 of our discussion about klezmer music. We're going to turn our attention to the old world style and talk about first our tradition and outgrowth of the vocal practice, and talk about unaccompanied folk song in the klezmer tradition. In order to really grasp one of the important and very iconic elements of klezmer music, I want us to listen to the particular mode that Jewish music and very specifically klezmer music uses. We have, let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. What's interesting in klezmer music is the use of this particular mode. I'm going to go ahead. It plays through a couple of times. What we're going to hear, though, is this very iconic jump between the second and third scale degrees of this particular mode. So in this case, when we're thinking about the intervallic content here, we have a lot of half steps, but also this this jump initially that we have. C to C sharp or D flat is a half step, and then we have a sizable jump from D flat or C sharp to the E. That interval, that sound, is particularly emblematic of klezmer music, and we're going to hear it a whole bunch in all of the examples that we listen to as a part of today's lecture. So just to review it one more time, this is the sound that we're looking for, this particular scale, this Jewish mode that's used in religious practice, but also within the context of klezmer music. And that, again, that motion, using this what we kind of identify as a kind of Phrygian mode is something that gives klezmer music its particular sound. I want to go back to my lecture notes, discuss a little bit about the old world style before playing an example of it. Let me go ahead and pull those up. Here we go. Okay. So, old world klezmer. From the 16th century, Central European Jews who were expelled or who fled persecution gradually migrated eastwards to areas controlled by Polish and Russian nobility. It wasn't until the late 18th century that the Jewish population of Eastern Europe was really confined to the cities and the villages of the Pale of Settlement. And over the next 100 years, Yiddish-speaking Jews were really absorbed musical influences that were a part of the surrounding cultures. And these influences certainly had an impact on the ensembles that were playing, klezmer music. And these instrumental ensembles, for the most part, initially were bands that were used as a way to accompany, celebration. And the main celebration that they typically would accompany is wedding ceremonies. A lot of times these wedding ceremonies would last for days. And oftentimes you would hear the same kind of music in a less perhaps formalized setting, even though weddings weren't exceptionally formal, we would hear these bands that were playing klezmer music in inns and taverns and marketplaces, and oftentimes there were sort of dances that accompanied these klezmer bands. Interestingly enough, there were some laws in place because not everyone loved the perpetuation of music and very loud music in the public sphere. So in the 19th century, klezmer ensembles were banned from making too much noise, and therefore the musicians opted to use instruments that were less timbrally abrasive or dynamic in terms of their volume. And that's where we get the melodic instruments really taken over by those softer, more subdued sounds of the violin, which certainly does make an appearance with the clarinet, but also the flute and the cymbalum. And I would love to show you an example of that instrument by itself, out of context of perhaps a klezmer ensemble. Let me go ahead and pull up an example of that instrument so you can see and hear, first off, see how it's played, the instrumental family that it's most closely related to, and of course the timbre of the instrument. It's not something that's in use as commonly anymore, but it really has quite a beautiful sound. So here's a view from the perspective of a cymbalum player. And I want you to just notice the construction of the instrument, the particular timbral qualities, and maybe if you've heard it before or something that's like it, maybe take note. I'll pause this real quick. We'll notice that there's a number of strings for every single particular pitch. The fact that there's multiple strings and they're slightly detuned from one another give this instrument its particular timbre or tone color. Notice also that we have this mechanism on both sides that seems to act very similarly to a piano damper, where when you have a pedal down, we don't have the felt dampers initiate contact with the strings. So we have this ability to let the strings resonate or to dampen them. So we have two kind of main sound categories within this one instrument. Also notice that all of the strings are metal. So we have this particular metallic sound that's iconic for this instrument. And the beaters that it's played with also help highlight that metallic sound that you hear in the instrument. before we kind of modulated key areas was definitely using this mode that I described that is most relatable to the Phrygian mode, where we have a huge preponderance of half steps that we're encountering in the harmonic language. It gives it that particular sound. Very good. I want to be sure to show you how the cymbalum is used in the context of other instruments. So why don't we go ahead and listen to it in the context of its larger klezmer family. Remember the cymbalum, otherwise known as a dulcimer, or at least fits into the dulcimer category. There are definitely differences between those instruments. However, I won't go into them at length right now. They have very similar timbral or tone color qualities to them. I'd like to play for you this accompanimental instrument in the context of klezmer music. So accompaniment, it's going to be used just to support the other instruments that are more often carrying the melody and are going to be mimicking the sound of the human voice. So again, going back to the first part of our lecture, a couple things that we're listening out for, not only this particular mode for klezmer music, but also the use of ornamentation that is directly derived from the tradition of cantering. So let me go ahead and pull up that listening example for us. This is again more old world style klezmer music using an older accompaniment instrument, the cymbalum. Okay, so in this listening example, the cymbalum is going to take the lead in the long introduction, after which the contrasting section, when we sort of pick up tempo, and we've seen this format as well in our second listening example that's a part of part one, what's going to happen is the instruments that more mimic the human voice, in this case the violins, are going to take over the melody. So interestingly, the accordion, the double bass here, really have accompanimental roles. The cymbalum is an interesting instrument that kind of goes between these two roles, and the two violins, for the most part, unless there's another instrument like the cymbalum that's taking the lead, they will, for the most part, play melody. But notice that they're going to fulfill accompaniment in the first and sort of longer introduction, where our cymbalum is really taking center stage. So let's go ahead and listen into a good chunk of this listening example. again, we're hearing a lot of reiteration of this mode, a lot of flexibility in time. Our instruments directly to the left and right of our cymbalom player are keeping a drone. The disparity in terms of range of these instruments gives it a very almost timbral sound that's similar to the accordion. So we have some interesting blend that's happening here. But again, structurally, very, very similar to our second listening example. We're going to hear this a lot, this elongated, elaborate introduction where we have a droning instrument and then one instrument or some other, some combination of instruments that are acting in tandem to create a melody that's very florid and melismatic in style. So again, the cymbalom is still playing the role of the melody. We've entered into a contrasting section. How do we know this? We've picked up tempo. We have another secondary violin that has been added into our mix. And it's generally has the opposite mood of what we were just listening to, which is one of the major ways in which we distinguish form in a piece of music, structure. We're doing one thing, and that's a part of a particular section. If we move on to something different, we've moved on to a new section. Sections are often repeated in a piece of music, but in order to even distinguish that we've moved on to a new section, something must be different. We either hear it in terms of melody, in terms of harmony, in terms of rhythm and meter, sometimes a combination of multiple different areas so that we can really be very clear to the audience what the structure of a particular piece is. While we're stopped, the cymbalom player, you can see his feet at this point, very similar to a piano. A pedal is operating the ability for the strings to continue resonating or for them to be dampened with felt dampers. So we have the ability to sustain very similarly to a piano. As you noticed, the cymbalom player took a major back seat where our violinist got to take the lead a little bit. And the role of who gets to play melody is often transferred to multiple instruments or multiple instrumentalists within a particular ensemble as well. So the more ensemble members that we have, the more dynamic our sound can be. Sometimes the longer the form can be because we have a variety of instruments that have the ability to take on the role of melody, some of them to be able to take on the role of accompaniment or to transition in between or in between different sections of a song or a particular piece of music. So what we just listened to, a much more dynamic ensemble that has cymbalum in it, that is where the cymbalum has a number of different roles it takes on. So very, very versatile instrument. Just really quickly, I'd love to see the cymbalum in one other context of a smaller instrumentation. Again, the cymbalum takes the center stage, but that's not always the case. There's plenty of instances in which the cymbalum player is really just a part of the accompaniment. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Okay, so as we can see here, we have a much smaller ensemble and one that's primarily stringed instruments, which is going to change the overall timbre of the ensemble quite a bit. Let's go ahead and listen.
Right? And sway, dry.
Wonderful. So a really delightful instrument to listen to. It has a very kind of soft volume overall. It doesn't have to be particularly pronounced. And yeah, it's really it's an old instrument. Sometimes we hear it in the context of street performers, and it's not the dulcimer-like construction is not only used in klezmer music. So if you're like, oh, I've heard this sound before, that instrument has a couple of different uses in other musical traditions outside of klezmer. I want to toggle over to my lecture notes real quick. Great. So as prohibitions against loud instruments were lifted in some areas towards the 19th century, the clarinet ended up taking over as the lead instrument in these klezmer ensembles. Which is an interesting timbral choice. We just listened to a lot of string instruments, the cymbalum often being paired with violins. The ensemble goes through some timbral development, which is very, very interesting. But again, everything is kind of coming back to this, this being an outreach of a vocal style first and foremost. So as a way of concluding this section 2, which is kind of really focusing on Old World klezmer, I want to play one example of an unaccompanied Yiddish folk song that, again, uses this very iconic mode that we've listened to in every single one of these listening examples, but hopefully highlights some of those ornamentation details that we've also heard in some of our other listening examples. So let me go ahead and pull that up for us real quick. Okay, so it's not completely unaccompanied, but we're going to hear a huge focus on the voice here. Notice our style of ornamentation that we've heard also carried over to our instrumental version of klezmer music. So again, a slight older world style that we're going to translate into the instrumental style that we just heard for a number of examples.
Di da 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 di, di da da do, di da da di, di da da do, di da da do, da di da da, da di da da, da di. Deny, 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 deny,
So again, this sort of rumination on a singular idea that has a lot of ornamentation that surrounds a particular pitch. You know, da 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 da. It's all focusing around this ba ba da da da, and sort of wiggling around it. And that's something that, again, we've heard in all of our listening examples. I want to sort of bridge these two things together and hear a voice in combination with a more full klezmer ensemble. Let me go ahead and pull up the listening example that's going to conclude our part 2 of our lecture. Hold on. Apologies, I misspoke. So this is using the same kind of melodic construct that we just listened to in the previous example. That's using the vocal part that we listened to as the basis to create the instrumental melody that we're hearing. Notice the accompaniment. We're going to be listening to the cymbalum one more time. This really bright and sparkly accompanimental timbre that's kind of almost a little zithery in sound, very metallic, and it really pierces through the texture of the ensemble. So this doesn't have our sort of longer ruminating opening that we've heard before, jumps right into something that's upbeat and what you could imagine could accompany a dance, for example. so far. We started with this opening section, which we're listening to again. We moved to a contrasting section, slightly different. It had a different melody, a slightly different accompaniment figure. It was a little bit more leaning towards the accordion. But here we're hearing the cymbalum in a much more accompaniment context, where it's less of the lead player, and we're depending on the string instruments as being mostly in charge of our melody. Let's listen in for one more minute, and then we'll conclude our second section. So notice that we went into a different section. Why our main metric feeling shifted at that point. So we're, in general, when we're listening to klezmer music, kind of similar to the jazz tradition, lots of things happening in sections where we're depending on the interaction between different performers to help create the form and the structure of the piece. And sectional music is easier for musicians to kind of think about and be able to perform. As you noticed, all of these examples that I've played for you, no one's looking at music. No one is reading from sheet music. It is all memorized. So the easier way to memorize larger pieces is to think about them in smaller chunks. And there's a bunch of freedom that's allowed within those sorts of larger chunks. So we're going to hear this again a lot in klezmer music in particular. So part 2 kind of concludes our discussion of the old world style. Part 3 and 4, we're going to talk about, what happens after this, what happens in the 20th and 21st centuries regarding klezmer music, and perhaps where is it headed now and what makes it different now than the old world style. So I'll see you back for part 3 and part 4 shortly.